Watch the of him in the back with an uppercut.
Okay, round two. Here we go.
This shit is real in the field, so I keep it still. This shit is real in the field, so I keep it still. This shit is real.
What's up, Seahawks fans? This is Danny Kelly. I'm joined by Kenneth Arthur from Field Goals and Davis Hsu from Field Goals. And we're going to talk about the NFL free agency and sort of give a pre-draft look at the Seahawks lineup and their roster and try and take it a little bit position by position and see what the Seahawks really need to do in free agency in order to be ready for the draft, and so they don't need to reach for anything or so they basically can go in with some flexibility. So why don't we just I think starting now with where the salary cap stands right now, I think is probably a good way to get going, and I'll just kind of kick it to Davis. Davis, we saw recently that the cap has been set at $143 million. Kind of where are we standing in terms of cap space and everything as far as your model is right now?
I don't really look at it in terms of cap space because I always kind of build in what I think is going to happen, in terms of extensions.
Yeah.
Whether that be an extension for J.R. Sweezy, an extension for Russell Wilson, a new deal for Marshawn Lynch. Not that that's going to change his cap number this year much. Obviously, it'll give him more cash. But to try to factor that in, I try to factor in like RFA tenders, like for Jermaine Kearse, possibly for Mike Morgan. So really, with the $143 or $144 million cap, really it boils down to about $130 million. I think that's a really important number, $130 million for the offense and the defense. Where's the other 13 or 14 million going to go? That's going to go to pay your kicker, your punter. There's a little bit of dead money that you have to pay for Percy Harvin. Now you have some rollover to offset maybe 60-70% of that, but you're still going to take a little bit of a charge for Percy Harvin, and then you're going to have IR and practice squad. Last year Seahawks had 17, 19 guys on IR, which is high, but you still got to factor in about 15 players on IR, and really you're paying for their replacement for, and not even for a full season, but you still have to factor in about $4.5 million for IR. So really it leaves about $130 million. Cap dollars, and the way I have it broken out, I think it's going to be about a $55 million cap charge on offense and more of a $75 million on defense, and I think that's kind of how it's going to kind of play out. Really what it says is you can really do probably one or two medium-sized defensive deals and then probably one medium-sized offensive deal. It'll probably cost you Tony McDaniel and Zach Miller to do that, but okay. I definitely think you could do two medium-sized defensive deals and one medium-sized offensive deal. If you get a really favorable contract with Russell Wilson or a real favorable contract, with Sweezy or Bobby Wagner, at least in terms of the first-year cap hit, maybe you could squeeze a little more out of there because really how you structure those kind of deals, it can create more room.
So you're talking about one or two additional outside free agents, right?
Yeah, I think it's really more like two or three because I think they are going to have a cap cut in there. Okay. So if you did like, let's say, a Jordan Cameron, his first year cap hit might not be very different than Zach Miller. So it's really not a big net add, at least this year, in terms of doing something like that. Same with the defensive tackle. You might even sign two defensive tackles, and one of them could take the place of Tony McDaniel, not just in terms of a player, but also in terms of his cap hit. If you cut him, you would save $2.5 million, and you could sign a $4 or $5 million player for $2.5 million in the first year in terms of his cap number. So those are kind of, I think, the pieces where they're not willing to let go of Tony or Zach until they really have that they've landed something.
Yeah.
Which is different than what you've been seeing in the last 2 weeks in the NFL. Because those teams are over the cap. The Seahawks are not over the cap, so they don't have to make these moves. Because let's say they don't land anyone that they think is a good value, they could still roll with Zach Miller. They could still roll with Tony McDaniel. It's really not the worst position to be in for those two players.
All right, well, and yeah, that makes total sense. And let's get Kenny. And Kenny, what's up, man? Sorry, I forgot to let everyone say hi before I kind of launched into that. But how you doing?
Oh, I'm good. I didn't need to, I think my presence.
We could feel your presence.
Exactly, that's.
We could hear your.
I bring a lot more to the table by not talking about the salary cap than talking about it.
So, I guess also, I mean, Davis kind of touched on it, but I wanted, and in my notes, I did all caps really quick update on the Russell Wilson contract. Davis, is there really anything new, any new information that we have in terms of what we can expect from Wilson, or is it kind of just still the waiting game?
It might be smarter to wait to see how. Maybe they have a thing where they're going to kind of see what's out there in free agency, and maybe they can morph him afterwards, or who knows, or maybe they don't do it this year. I don't know. I'm just saying, maybe, I do think there is something to that idea of the lower average per year with the higher guarantees. Maybe the whole thing isn't fully guaranteed, but instead of guaranteeing 50 or 60, maybe they guarantee 70 to 80 million, which would still be unprecedented. So, I've been toying around, could you do a deal like $100, $110 million, most of that fully guaranteed? There's a lot of different numbers that I've been kind of playing around with, but I almost feel like that maybe I don't think you're going to see anything in the next week or so for that. I think it could be, let's kind of see how this free agency period peels out. I mean, he's your long-term stake that you need to have that you're not going to lose for any reason at all.
Right.
You could franchise a guy 3 times in a row. That's not against the CBA.
Wow.
What's that?
I said, wow. I actually thought it was only 2.
No, I think there is a provision for that, but it gets really, really painful. So it's almost like it'll never happen. But and maybe for a quarterback they limited it too. I forget. But I looked it up. There's that you can actually franchise a player more than 2 times. But
it's like a 20%.
Yeah, it just starts escalating at such a rate that it probably would really never get there. But the franchise tag is really just a way to set up the negotiation. It's really not used as much for a quarterback, but it's more just to kind of set the parameters for talking.
I think it's the reason it's not used, and the reason that it's not used for the quarterback is because you just know that they're so valuable that you're going to take care of that person before it comes to that, because you would much rather use the franchise tag on a player that is more likely to get I guess you want to have that franchise tag around for when someone else hits free agents. Like they would rather figure something out with Russell Wilson, and then if it really came down to it, put the franchise tag on Bobby Wagner so that you can keep both of those guys. But when people talk about I'm worried about losing Russell Wilson, it's just so that's not even a part of football. You can't lose. Basically, you can't lose a franchise quarterback. It's never, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, in the modern era, it's never happened unless there was an extenuating circumstance.
Right.
Yeah, like anything where it's like Drew Brees, and then that's such a rare instance where A, his backup is Phillip Rivers, and B, he's got a shoulder injury.
Right.
If they'd known what they, obviously they could have re-signed Drew Brees and then traded Phillip Rivers or whatever if they had known, but it's just one of those things where these guys don't go anywhere. If it's a guy like, say, Jay Cutler, then the most that happens is they get traded for something if it's not going to work out there. If it's a guy like Matt Castle when he was with the Patriots, and I believe they placed a franchise tag on him before trading him to Kansas City just because they were like, well, this is so valuable, we can get something out of this. We're not going to let it go. So, there is no risk of losing Russell Wilson, period, unless something happens that makes him a concern.
Expendable.
Right, which also never happens, almost never. So Russell Wilson is coming back. I guess the most interesting thing as far as the cap is, as far as I think, is the $7 million that would be gained or against the cap if Marshawn Lynch was traded or released. So, if that $7 million became available, I wonder, Davis, do you have any idea, if you had a little bit more cap room, is that going to make is that $7 million, is that going to make a huge difference as far as how you think they'd play with it, or do you think they're still not really interested in signing those big name free agents? They would rather roll it over.
No, I don't think they would roll it over. If they had $7 million freed up, I think they would use it. Because one, you could, if you wanted to do Byron Maxwell at that point, you probably could. Now at the same time, they might be thinking, hey, he's a $6-7 million player in the way we evaluate. Okay, and we have $9 or $10 million players. Their names are Earl Thomas and Richard Sherman, and we don't think he's on that level. So that's not a good use of $9 million, But for $7 million, you could probably go out and get 2 Steve Smiths, so to speak.
Right.
When I say Steve Smith, I'm not talking about that Steve Smith. I'm saying you could probably go out and get 2 players like that are good, that are maybe have a knock on them. You could go out and get 3 Darnell Dockett's or something, or does that make sense? So,
Yep.
So I think they would go after a premium guy with that $7 million, like a 26-year-old premium player, or they can possibly go after getting kind of more of the value play, an Andre Johnson, that type of thing, or a Brandon Marshall or whatnot, or a bunch of other, 2 cornerbacks. Again, I don't know if they would really do that, but yeah, I think they would be able to use it, because if they've already said, hey, we're going to lock up Bobby Wagner, we're going to lock up Russell Wilson no matter what, there's really only one other guy to really pay that's really in question. That would be Maxwell. And again, they might just not do that no matter what, even if they had the money freed up. So yeah, I don't know if they have, major new expenditures outside of that on their own roster, because there's only 2 guys that are worth the franchise tag on the Seahawks. It's Russell Wilson and Bobby Wagner. And I kind of don't think they're losing either of those 2, and they definitely have the money for both of them as well.
And that's kind of a good segue into what I kind of wanted to talk about. We can go through it real quick. Kenny, for you, what are your, what are the 3 positions that you think the Seahawks are most likely to go for in free agency specifically?
Well, I think number 1 would be, and it doesn't necessarily have to be free agency, but it could just be a way that they expend their salary cap in terms of a trade. But I think wide receiver is still number 1.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the history of Pete Carroll and John Schneider, you've got Sidney Rice and Percy Harvin. Like, this is where they spend, a lot of their free agent type money, is where they're looking to add a playmaker at the receiver position, and at the same token with Zach Miller, someone that can catch the ball and is that dynamic playmaker in that sense. And it hasn't worked out at all. But it doesn't mean that I think that they're necessarily going to stop trying. I think that, I think Pete Carroll has a philosophy and he sticks to it. So I think that philosophy is going to go somewhere along the lines of exploring, a trade for Andre Johnson or Brandon Marshall. That's definitely the type of guy that it seems like they need, is a big red zone target that's going to change. I think it would be a huge difference if they had someone that was, a more of a threat in the red zone. And especially now, I don't know necessarily if they will use. I don't know necessarily how much of Jermaine Kearse is in the plans for next year. I think that they still need. I don't know if he's necessarily filling the biggest need, but I do think that he's come up with some huge plays, and that's something that can't be ignored either. Outside of that, defensive tackle will probably come in there in the top 3. They're going to lose, or they could lose Kevin Williams, as Davis said earlier. They could cut Tony McDaniel. They don't have a whole lot going on there, but I still think that it's a very important position. And, Brandon Mebane's coming off of injury. So, and there are guys now like Vince Wilfork is going to hit free agency, and that should push everyone else, or a lot of guys down a notch, meaning that, if someone's going to sign Vince Wilfork, that means that they're not going to sign, Terrence Knighton, and someone else is going to sign Terrence Knighton, and it's going to push everyone down a little bit. So I think they could probably get a good pick there as far as defensive tackle. So I think, that's another one. And then, they just need other options at offensive line. They've got James Carpenter going into free agency, and they've got Russell Okung and Max Unger hitting, they've been injured. a few times over the last couple of years. So I just think there's more depth on the offensive line, not necessarily a starter, but someone to compete. So wide receiver, defensive tackle, and probably something like guard, I would think, is where they're going to look so that they don't necessarily have to do that in the draft.
Davis, would you add any position groups to that?
I don't think they're going to go O-line because I don't think they've shown that they've gone on an outside O-lineman since Robert Gallery of anyone that's ever earned over $2 million. So I think Tom Cable, I think it's a really thick guard draft, and whether that's talking about a tackle that you convert to guard, and I don't think there's a lot of guards out there right now that are going to be like a much way better value play than just re-signing Carpenter. And I don't think they're going to re-sign Carpenter. So I don't see O-linemen at all. I don't see them upgrading to Mike Iupati.
Right.
I just don't see it. I mean, I
definitely don't see Iupati. I don't see like the big name. Maybe just like someone, like I said, to compete. But you could.
I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, maybe an Eric Winston, but that's a type of deal where that type of player, not Eric Winston himself, but it's like C-level free agency. That's not even worth talking about here to me. C-level free agency in terms of under $2 million with low guarantees. It's like those guys aren't guaranteed any roster spots anyway. And yes, they're going to sign C-level guys, whether it's going to be now or whether it's going to be in August, or
like Mr. Alexander.
Or I mean, he's even a below a C-level guy, I would say.
Well, now I'm going to root for them to sign an offensive lineman just so I can say in your face, but you probably won't.
But I mean, in terms of a cap, in terms of a major thing, I think that they're going to go after a defensive tackle. I definitely think they'll go after a corner, it sounds like. I think the Jeremy Lane injury, I think, is a major deal because not only is it Maxwell, but then you have Lane, and it wasn't just a shattered arm. Now it's an ACL. So Jeremy Lane's probably never going to play for the Seahawks ever again.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if he's going to play next year at all. And so that's a major, major thing that they slipped in there. Oh, yeah, he tore his ACL as well. It's like, and he tore his ACL in the same way.
It's like, hey, we're getting a divorce. Oh, and the kid's not yours either.
Right, yeah. It's like, I'll just throw that in there. So, obviously, corner all of a sudden jumped up. But I think in terms of like the cornerback market, in terms of the draft, which I do think shapes free agency big time, the type of big, long corners just really aren't sitting there this year in the draft. They're definitely not sitting there in the 5th round or 6th round in terms of combine invites. Now, if you want to go to a super, super duper small school, the type of small school that looks like it's a high school when you're watching film, in terms of that kind of tape, I'm sure you could find a guy with 32-inch arms at 6'1", playing at a school that you've never, ever heard of, and probably draft him in the 5th round. But Byron Maxwell and Richard Sherman were combine invites. And I don't think you're going to find anything like that in terms of that size and speed combination in the 5th or 6th round.
Yeah.
You can find a guard this year in the 4th round. So I think that, it's kind of almost like I feel like the draft could kind of dictate a little bit of how you approach free agency. Lastly, I would totally support a wide receiver. If they were able to get a tight end, it would be a cleaner switch if you swapped out Zach Miller for the tight end and saved the money, because the tight end class in the draft is really, really poor.
Yeah.
I'm not even really that excited about Max Williams, to be honest with you. I'm trying to like him, but I'm really not liking him that much.
Especially where you got to get him.
Yeah, and then all throughout there, I'm looking at these guys that are, maybe some get pushed up in the 3rd round. Really, they should go in the 4th round, and maybe the guys in the 4th round are maybe number 2s, at best. Maybe one of them becomes something. But so I think, I would totally support an Andre Johnson, Brandon Marshall, big wide receiver, and it seems like there's a lot of them out there. But if they were able to get a tight end, it might be a little bit cleaner in terms of kind of the way their roster stacks up and the way the draft stacks up, I think.
Let me ask you this. When you picture the 2 main tight ends that are out there right now, that's Julius Thomas from the Broncos, who has been linked to the Seahawks. not only recently, but he was also linked to the Seahawks when they were trying to get rid of Percy Harvin. And then Jordan Cameron, who do you think fits this offense better, I guess, would be the question. Davis?
I'm not – I mean, I don't know if either of them – I think we're looking for another Zach Miller but faster, and I don't know if that guy is really out there.
Yeah.
And, you look at the tight ends, they're all running 4.7s, 4.8s in this draft. And you look at the guys that are running 4.5s, 4.6s, and they're basically fourth, fifth rounders at best, and they're not complete tight ends in terms of the whole package.
Right.
I don't know if Jordan Cameron or Julius Thomas are the complete package either. I don't think they really are. But really what we're looking for is Zach Miller, but if he could run a 4.6, And I don't know if that guy's really there. So.
Well, one name that I wanted to throw out, and I don't know if you've looked at him at all, but this Virgil Green has been sort of making some noise lately in terms of a sleeper free agent. I know that the Broncos have said they want him back, probably because they're going to lose Julius Thomas. But from the things that I've read, I didn't watch tape on him yet, but the things that I've read, he's a really good blocker, but he's also like, I think Zach said he's a 2 or 2.5 sigma athlete in terms of he ran like a 4.5. He's got a 42-inch vert and a 10.10 broad jump when he came out. And he's 6'3", 255. So he's one guy that I've kind of, I haven't studied him closely, but I've kind of had my eye on him because he's more known for his blocking right now than he is for his catching. But he's obviously got the speed that the Seahawks tend to really like there. So that's just one guy to keep an eye on.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say as well. If you had come to me next, I want all the listeners to know, I would have said I actually prefer Virgil Green to Julius Thomas. And it's really, I think it's in terms of a money thing. I think he's more valuable per dollar. I mean, it's funny because it's like, yeah, that's the thing is that 2 years ago, Julius Thomas was Virgil Green. He had nothing on his resume.
Right.
And then he came out and he was put in a great situation. And, again, it's so easy to say, like, that you like a player based on a number of things. Like, the funny thing is that sometimes I want to be like, oh, yeah, Virgil Green, he reminds me of Ladarius Green of the San Diego Chargers. And I don't know if that's just because they both have the last name Green. And it's just, you sometimes figure it out. But for some reason, you're like, oh, yeah, I like Virgil Green. Sounds like a good name. And he's got, he's buzzing. So it's like, it sounds like he's got this great athlete, and if you want to listen to PFF grades, he's got some of the highest blocking grades at tight end. And if you want to, do any of that stuff. So, but I do think, and you mentioned that they were linked to Julius Thomas. They were also linked to Jordan Cameron. People were saying that they had offered the Browns Percy Harvin for Cameron straight up or something. And I think Cameron could, if he wants to come in on sort of a Henry Melton deal, like the one that Melton signed with the Cowboys, where he's got a 1-year prove-it deal and a 3-year option, then I think that's something that's worth exploring because, this was one of the best receivers, and you just call him a receiver. He was one of the best receivers in 2013, where he was going up and it was hard to defend him.
He had 80 catches for 917 yards that year.
I mean, it's crazy. And he was playing with the Browns.
Yeah.
Exactly. That was him and Gordon. It was actually made the Browns. I don't even know who the quarterback was that year. I can't.
Hoyer, maybe? No, I don't even know.
Yeah, Hoyer started 3 games. Whedon started a handful. And I think even Jason Campbell started the finale or something.
The point is he didn't have Peyton Manning throwing him the ball.
And he didn't have Russell Wilson throwing the ball. And I think that Darrell Bevel draws up enough interesting plays for Luke Wilson that if you had Jordan Cameron, it might be a lot better. So I definitely am interested in Cameron, and on a lesser note, I'm interested in Virgil Green because it sounds nice, and it probably wouldn't cost that much.
Davis, are you still on the Jermaine Gresham train at all?
I mean, I think you gotta. He would add something to us. I'm not a huge fan of him, but at the same time, I'm not a big believer in Luke Wilson. I mean, I think Luke Wilson is a fine number 2 tight end, but his hands aren't that good, and so
Gresham?
He's good. Oh yeah, well, I take his hands over Luke Wilson. I mean, Luke Wilson.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Has speed and he has yak, but some of the passes they throw him, I mean, Russell Wilson's lobbing it up to him and they're making it real easy for him, and he's taking it, and then he breaks a few tackles and he runs, or he ran the distance, which is cool, but sometimes it's more like the first down is almost just as important as a touchdown, and it's like, I would trust Zach Miller more in some of those situations than Luke Wilson. I would trust Jermaine Gresham more than Luke Wilson in some of their more those non-explosive type situations, but you need that first down.
Davis, we never got your opinion on this. Do you think a touchdown would have been important at the end of the Super Bowl?
First down, touchdown, either way, at that point, it would have worked.
I think it would have been
however
worked.
you want to call it there.
So
I think Virgil Green, the other thing about Virgil Green is if they lose Julius Thomas, Elway is going to make a strong push for Virgil Green.
He's going to throw some cash at him.
He's going to.
I don't think there's any way the Broncos lose them both.
Right.
Probably right, yeah.
And then the other thing is, even other guys like Lance Kendricks and some of these other guys at the right price, I still think they can add something. Again, not saying that they are going to be the number one, dude for us, but I think I'm just kind of open to a lot of options there because the draft class is pretty underwhelming.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think in general, the tight end position will be one to watch because I think there's really a lot of ambiguity with Miller. Part of me thinks they'll just bring him back move at that position. They'll just run with Miller and Wilson. But then again, they asked him to take a pay cut last year. They could do that again, or they could just release him outright.
Do you guys think? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Do you guys think that the fact? I mean, and this is what I read. So correct me if I'm wrong. But do you think the fact that they are even talking to Kerry Williams, who is going to be 31, or no, he'll be 30 throughout the season, but he's 30, and it's not like he would cost a lot. But do you think that's a change at all in their philosophy, or do you think that's sort of like, oh yeah, they need a cornerback, so a veteran would be, he might not be more, he'd just be more ready to step in rather than someone they can mold into the player that they want him to be? Do you think that's a change in philosophy, or do you think it's just just a low key, not a big deal?
Well, I would say, number one, I think the Seahawks generally, they like to have options before they go into the draft. So, like Davis was saying, with Lane and Maxwell likely both gone this year, they're basically, they don't have a lot of choice if they go into the draft without another corner because they're going to have to take a guy early, and everyone's going to know it. And I don't think they like being in that position where they have to reach for a guy. So, even if they think that Harold Simon's going to be the starter out there, I think, as we've seen, they like to have competition. They like to have depth, and cornerback and defensive back are huge in the system. And you can never have enough depth at the corner position. I mean, if you look back a couple of years ago, the Seahawks had probably the best defensive backfield in the history of the NFL when they had Browner, Sherman, Chancellor, Earl, Lane, Walter Thurman,
Ron Parker,
Blackman.
Will Blackman.
God, yeah, Will Blackman, Ron Parker. Ron Parker is
Winston
probably
Guy, Chris Maragos.
Jeez.
I mean,
yeah. I mean, so I think honestly, people are probably looking into the idea that they're going to go and try and get a corner. I think they're reading into it a little bit too much. I think it's just typical Seahawks MO. They want as much depth as they can at that position. Right now, the cornerback position is light on depth, and so signing a veteran that could either start or back up, Harold Simon is huge. And I think, I don't really read too much into it. I think it's just standard operating procedure for them. Mm-hmm. They don't want to go into the draft needing two corners desperately.
I guess, yeah.
I think the corner thing is a bunch of little misses and a bunch of little things that have moved against them, where I don't think they want to go into the free agent market for corner, but I think it's been a series of things that have kind of rolled against them, I think, over the past, 3 or 4 years or two years. One would be even when they gave Brandon Browner another, they let him count that year of, and maybe they always knew this, but when they let him count that year in Denver as an accrued season, and then he was, instead of being a restricted free agent, he was going to be unrestricted. I remember at that day when I found that out, I'm like, oh man, that's a pretty major difference,
It was
because
a whole season. Yeah.
that's a huge season. And then boom, does New England win the Super Bowl without Brandon Browner?
Shut up.
Would we win the Super Bowl with Brandon Browner as our guy coming off the bench? Probably do. And so little things like that. And then when you look at the draft, I don't think they ever wanted to spend a 6th-round pick to get Marcus Burley, but they kind of had to do that because they weren't really able to. I feel like in the 4th round, they never wanted to get Kevin Norwood. They wanted to take a corner, but the way the corners fell off the board, it was almost like they kept falling. And I think Kevin Norwood was more like a backup option for Richardson or Matthews or whoever was maybe in the 2nd or 3rd round. And they're like, well, he's our highest-rated guy. Let's take him. Then they took Pinkins. That didn't work out. Then they moved him back to safety. And then all the other guys that they've kind of put in there, it just and then the injury to Lane, and then Maxwell thinking they could probably re-sign Maxwell for $6 million, and now they find out no, he's going to cost $8 to $9 million. So I think it's been a series of things that have kind of worked against him at the cornerback position, and now they're at that place. I don't know if they're changing their philosophy, but they're doing something they would rather not do. But I think they know they have to do because the Super Bowl was essentially won and lost on backup cornerback play and lack thereof.
Yeah, and I remember going back and watching some of these games. Like I remember watching the 49ers-Packers playoff game last season and thinking, and it just struck me how important good defensive back play was. And I just, ever since then, like that's been my number one priority is having depth and having a lot of good backups at that position. Because, I mean, if you look back when the Seahawks lost Browner, last season in 2013, I should say, when they lost Browner, they lost Walter Thurman for a while to suspension and injuries, and you have backups come in and there's like they don't even miss a beat. Like to me, that is so huge. And if you look at the beginning of this season, the 2014 season, when the Seahawks were playing with Steven Terrell and Marcus Burley for a stretch there, they just weren't very good on defense. They were giving up a lot of yards and they just weren't their normal shutdown selves. And so I think we saw that.
Butler,
we saw that in the Super Bowl.
Malcolm Butler played 18 snaps, and it was like, to have
the most
a guy
important 18 snaps ever. Yeah.
Right. If you can, and it's backups won. Backups were. I don't know if it's like this every year, but backups were such an important part of the Super Bowl this year. I mean, Chris Matthews played 17 snaps and he had over 100 yards. Malcolm Butler played 18 snaps and he was player of the game at the end. That's definitely, the Seahawks, most of their secondary was hurt. So it's definitely it's important to have that. It's overlooked, but and then the Seahawks, they're in a position that I don't think that they've
been there for a while.
Right. Yeah. This is a very different position than the last couple of years where it's not necessarily like they're going to lose a bunch of stars or anything like that, but they do have a lot more maybe to, sort of reinforce with the fact that Maxwell is gone and Marshawn Lynch is a question mark and Jeremy Lane is gone and, there's definitely, and then, the other questions that have to come up like Zach Miller and defensive tackle and Kevin Williams and what they're going to do there. So it's definitely a much different situation. When I think we tend to overreact to everything at this point because the season is so far away and we're still, there's so many variables that could have happened between now and then. I still think the Seahawks are probably the best team in the NFL. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the Patriots based on, Devin McCourty being a free agent and letting Vince Wilfork go. But it's the whole roster that ended up playing a difference on the Super Bowl.
So let's switch gears a little bit here, and I just want to, and not necessarily switch gears, but in your guys' dream scenario, and Davis, I'll start with you, and then Kenny, we can go to you on this. Who are the top 2 or 3 guys in your dream scenario that the Seahawks would sign this offseason? Davis, you said they could do probably 2 or 3. Who would be like your ideal if you could just draw it up right now?
Honestly, I'd go with either Jordan Cameron or Julius Thomas as kind of my main ideal.
And switch them out with Miller?
and switch him out with Miller. Although if they
Okay.
did an Andre Johnson or a Brandon Marshall, that's cool too, and I can definitely roll with that. In terms of the defensive line, I don't know. I'm really open to a lot of things. I've been looking back at the way the Seahawks have done their defensive line, and I would say they definitely need a base-only player. They need another nickel-only player, and then they need basically that what's that guy's name with a French name? The other option could be like the DeMarcus Dobbs or Ricky Jean-Francois, basically that sixth D lineman.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
a little bit of a flex type player. So you kind of need about 3 guys on the defensive line, and maybe you go 2 in free agency, 1 in the draft, or 1 in free agency, 2 in the draft, that type of thing. But I don't know. For some reason on the defensive line, I'm really open because they don't need to get one specific, like he has to be a base 3 tech or he has to be a Henry Melton type. I think whatever value thing kind of presents itself there, of almost any shape and size of a guy, and almost at any age and place in his career, I think there's a fit there. I mean, it's like there's a lot of options. And then if you could find 2 nice value options or 1 big option like Jared Odrick, I wouldn't be opposed to that. I'm sure they could find a place for him.
Right.
Of course, he's going to cost more than Kendrick Ellis or Paella or whatever. But it's like you can mix and match. They've shown a lot of different hands. Like the year they came out with Alan Branch and Jason Jones. The other year they came out, 2013, where they were so loaded that they had to cut Jay Howard. They had to cut Clinton McDonald.
Oh, yeah.
And they were just loaded. They had Red Bryant. They were just they were stacked, and they kind of configured it in a little bit of a different way with like Chris Clemens and whatnot. So they don't have to come out every year and stack the defensive line, with exactly this type of player. But you have to kind of have the whole draft and free agency, in total, and so kind of really wide open on the defensive line. I just feel like there's a lot of different fits that could work there. I hope that's not a cop out, but I just because even a Paella, you kind of have Jordan Hill. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like it's a little bit redundant. Now it's not bad to have 2.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of a lot of arguments in my head there on the defensive line in terms of the different types, the different body types, ages. I think you could be more flexible with age there. I don't think age is as big of a deal on the defensive line, And sometimes some of those younger defensive linemen aren't as strong as they're going to be, and some of them haven't learned how to take care of their body yet, so they get injured a lot.
Yeah.
So sometimes that early rookie defensive lineman it's not like plugging and playing some other positions.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. All right, well, Kenny, what do you think? Do you recently did a top 100 or top 150 in terms of free agents? Do you have a few favorites that you like for the Seahawks or that you've sort of penciled in as like your dream scenario?
No, I dream bigger than that. I don't dream about football. I dream about finding a wife and that kind of stuff. But as far as the Seahawks go, and there are free agents out there that I personally like. And as far as being fits, it's sort of secondary to me. Not like to me there's just players that I like to see play, and I think that if you put them in a position I think the Seahawks would be good putting him in the right position. I've liked Nick Fairley since he was coming out of college. I've loved Nick Fairley.
Yeah.
So, he's 27. He's had some injuries. He's had some, other issues. But as far as Hsu versus Fairley, Hsu is a special player, but I think he carries too much of a risk, and obviously is out of the Seahawks price range. So, I don't know what Nick Fairley is going to cost. And I don't know if the Lions are going to make a hard push to keep him because they didn't tag Hsu, but I'm a big fan of Fairley. If not, and then a better player than that probably would be Terrence Knighton. I think that he would make a huge difference on the defensive line and sort of, change how good the Seahawks are up front. So that's another sort of dream scenario. I think as far as receivers go, I think Torrey Smith might not be as expensive as he would have been a couple years ago, but I think he's a very smart player, a very fast player, and the type of player that sort of could be a Sidney Rice, what they wanted Sidney Rice to be. So, Torrey Smith is another one that I would take a look at, a cheaper option, and one that probably might not be as good, but is actually younger, would be Kenny Britt. Another big guy that a few years ago looked like he could be one of the top receivers in the NFL, and then he wasn't, and he's had his off-field issues, but it hasn't happened lately. Sort of a less important name, but someone that could be interesting and someone that could fit the style of offense should Russell Wilson not be able to play a game, would be Jake Locker. I think that, I don't have any sort of personal feelings towards Locker, quite the opposite. I don't give a shit about the Huskies, so it has nothing to do with that. I think that he's an athletic player that has a lot of upside, so there's a situation there where you want to take, risks or low risks on quarterbacks with starter upside. Now, he might not want to come here because he might want a chance to start, but he might also want a chance to start over. So I think there might be a reason for him to come here. And then another wide receiver that would be really cheap that you might be able to get like for 1 year and maybe $2 million would be Nate Washington. So that's another guy that I guess I would sort of look at. He's got the type of skill set at receiver that we lack, and so Nate Washington to Washington would be something that I'd look out for personally. What about you, Danny?
Well, I think I'm kind of the same way. I have a whole bunch of guys on my list that I think would be interesting. Like I've always thought that having Brian Arakpo come here and play like a Leo position would be really interesting. And so if he was, if he finds his market kind of on the lower end, kind of like how it happened with Cliff Averill and Michael Bennett a couple of years ago, like I think Brian Arakpo could be an interesting guy. He's had an injury. He was injured most of this year. In 2013, he had 10 sacks. I think adding one more like rusher to me sounds like a good idea, just because you don't still really driven. Like he's a good pass rusher, but he's still raw. He's still trying to put it all together. And like we saw in the Super Bowl when Cliff Averill went out, the pass rush just kind of disappeared. So for me, having one more guy that can really, you can rely on to pass rush, and that would kind of give them, it could go back to their sort of 2013 look where they were rotating pass rushers a lot. So he would be a guy near the top of my list in terms of interesting potential targets. I guess he's probably second tier in terms of he's got those injury issues and he's getting a little older, so he may not get like top ticket number or top ticket money. So he mentioned Stephen Paella. He's an interesting player. I think Kenrick Ellis from the Jets is a guy that could come in and like play the nose tackle and just stuff the run and just be that, one of the like war daddies on the inside that the Seahawks need on base downs. I'm still sort of thinking if the Tramon Williams or Kerry Williams thing doesn't really near minimum deal, wouldn't be a terrible idea. And even you could even do two free agents if that were the case, because Thurman's just been not that reliable. But at the same time, he knows the system. He's going to come cheap. He's played here before. He can play on the outside and in the inside, and that just he could add a little bit of value. That's like secondary or very low level free agency in my mind. I'm not advocating giving him a big contract by any means, but he's another guy that I kind of just have penciled in terms of an interesting target. So yeah, those are the main ones about Thurman.
Yeah, it's interesting that you advocate giving him a big deal, so I want to know. No, definitely someone that on the low end would be interesting.
Yeah.
So one of the 49ers beat reports says the Seahawks are interested in Trent Cole.
That'd be interesting.
Matt Barrows.
I would like to have him go up against Russell Okung in practice every day. Wasn't he the guy that tore Russell Okung's neck? Yeah.
The 49ers and Seahawks are two of the teams who have called to inquire about pass rusher Trent Cole, who the Eagles released on Wednesday, according to a league source. Cole is visiting the Buccaneers today. He's 32. So
Don't they
So to
call
me-
everyone?
They do probably. Yes.
Yes, I'm
To
sure
me,
they
Cole.
do.
To me, Cole is exactly what I'm talking about when I was talking about Rakpo. He's a guy that is proven.
Yeah.
He's relatively consistent. You know, he's a guy that if you have an injury, he's gonna go. You can plug him in and know that he will. You know, he'll be disruptive at the very least. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they would go for a guy like that. And you know what? I even threw this out in an article the other day. Like Dwight Freeney's a free agent. You know, he would have a very limited role in terms of Seattle. He's not going to be a three-down guy by any means, but if you need to put in a package that you can have 3 or 4 dudes rushing the passer, I wouldn't mind having Freeney, you know, come over here for a lowish deal.
Well, look, you know,
same sort of thing.
Last year, Kevin Williams played a pretty big role in the team. He played a lot of downs. He was a big name. Now, he was a big name, you know, past his prime, but a big name, and they signed him in June. So, you know, there's going to be a lot of those guys that we're going to get through these, you know, first few weeks of free agency, then the draft, then, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these other free agents might as well just sit it out and wait for a good situation because, you know, I think Arakpo will probably sign early, but
Probably.
yeah, just, you know, maybe someone like Trent Goldwaits. I definitely, I'm glad that I didn't say Arakpo, so I didn't hog all the names, but that's another guy that I was definitely, you know, you're like, wow, that guy is good, and he shouldn't be as cheap as he's going to be based on what we've seen him do in the past, but he is going to be because of the injuries and stuff like that. So, and he's not old or anything, so that's definitely something that you want to take advantage of.
Yeah.
The other thing would be Jabal Sheard. The question is for me does he rush on the weak side? And maybe that shouldn't matter, but I think it kind of does. I think certain players like to play on one side or the other, and some players are good enough to play really good on both sides. But you know, I really feel we need a weak side pass rusher.
I agree.
We have the combination of Michael Bennett and Averill stunting essentially on the strong side, and I think that has a lot of value. But to have almost like a weak side pass rusher that kind of can get home kind of on their own move, so to speak, you know?
Yeah.
And I don't know if Jabal Sheard's that guy. Maybe he is, but I kind of think he might be another strong side rusher. I don't even know if Irvin should be a weak side rusher, to be honest with you. But so those are some of the things I'm trying to pay attention to, even in terms of watching some of these college guys, you know. Now, those guys are mostly gone by 31, but, like, does he rush? Which side of the ball is he rushing on, you know, and does that matter? And I, you know, just something to think about, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and that's kind of what I was alluding to when I said, you know, I specifically, I don't know if Arakpo would be perfect for this, but I would see him as the dedicated weak side rusher, a guy who's upfield all the time. You know, he's not a guy that has to set the edge and you know, take on a tight end or whatever. He's just going upfield and wrecking havoc in the backfield. And so, you know, whether it's Arakpo or Sheard. Brandon Graham is another guy who's out there who in limited snaps this year was really productive.
What do you guys think of Derek Morgan?
I don't really know a lot about him, but he's another name that, you know, he's a pass rusher that's out there right now that he's put up some good stats in the past. I honestly don't know much about him though.
You know what Derek Morgan reminds me of? He reminds me of what the Seahawks would have drafted, because that's exactly who runs the Tennessee Titans, is the ex-Seahawks. He just seems like a Rustin Wester pick.
Webster.
Rubston Wester.
Yeah, he looks completely to me like an old Seahawks regime in that period.
Lawrence Jackson.
I mean, better than Lawrence Jackson, but you're the type of guy they would pick, which is exactly the type of guy, like they would take a Jake Locker, they would take Bishop Sankey, and they would take Marcus Mariota, because I think that's another kind of person that they actually would like. I don't know if Ken Wisenhunt would like him, but I think that's the kind of guy that Wester would like.
Well, I do remember in 2010 a lot of people mocked Derek Morgan to the Seahawks at 14 because they probably for those same reasons. They're like, oh yeah, he's a Seahawks type guy, but they didn't know what was going to happen under the new coach and GM, and that's when they took Earl Thomas instead of Derek Morgan, who went 2 picks later. So, you know, and I know that Derek Morgan, I feel like he hasn't worked out quite as well as Earl Thomas. I could be wrong about that. But, Derek Morgan, he is still like, he's not a bad player. He's someone that's, again, I'm not going to pretend like I watch every snap of Derek Morgan, but it does seem like, okay, there's another guy that has some talent at least, and could potentially, fill a role on the Seahawks if they talk to him. I don't know, but I do want Danny to totally agree with me on something, so I'm just sort of going for something like that.
Yeah, and it's when I picture it in my head, like when we're talking about a weak side rusher, or we're talking about someone that's going to take O'Brien Schofield's snaps or more. Schofield at times was playing 20-something snaps a game this year, and I didn't watch him specifically very closely, but he wasn't an impact player. And so someone
they have Marsh too. That's another thing is with Marsh, like how much of a role is he going to play, and or is it just like, hey, you need pass rushers? Who cares? You stack them up. One of them's going to get hurt.
Yeah,
stack them up.
That's kind of how I look at it, honestly. Just you can never have enough pass rushers, and let them figure out, let them sort it out what the sort of rotation will be once we get to that point. Obviously, I just think injuries are bound to happen, and the more you can have, like the O'Brien Schofield thing to me is just like how I picture it. It's like you want a guy who's better than O'Brien Schofield rushing the pass from the weak side next year. To me, that's kind of one of those things I think.
Well, Davis, let me ask you a question. Because you've got two guys that will hit free agency next year if they don't get re-signed or whatever. So tell me which one, if you could only choose one, which one would you choose? Russell Okung or Bobby Wagner?
Bobby Wagner, for sure. Because I think you could get Russell Okung back. I really do. I think you could get him back.
Well, that does sound like a cop-out to me, because I'm asking you to choose one.
No,
you're going to lose the other one.
Oh, yeah, I would always take Bobby Wagner for sure, irregardless. And I would let, if we lost Okung, I could live with that. I really wouldn't feel good about losing Bobby Wagner. I mean, you got 6 good years out of Okung. That's still still a good pick. That's still a great situation. But if Wagner left after 4 years, there seems like there'd be a ton of unfinished business.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing, Kenny. I think, we talked about this the other day I went on Softy with Hawkblogger, and they brought up the idea of losing Wagner, and I'm like, he's like Russell Wilson's 1A, and then Wagner's 1B. Like, you cannot let Wagner go.
No.
In my mind, I think he's one of the more important players on the defense.
It is a unique situation because you would say most of the time an inside linebacker versus a left tackle, usually the left tackle. But obviously
that's a good point.
There's a talent disparity there. But Wagner is a special inside linebacker, sort of like a Luke Kuechly, where you couldn't necessarily because for the most part, I mean, if you look at inside linebackers that are on free agency this year, they're not bad players. It's like guys like, for example, a guy like Brandon Spikes, who's a good linebacker, but not really that big of a free agent, and a guy that sort of moves around. You look at a guy like probably the top middle linebacker available in free agency, like Rolando McClain, who just, had a career revival in Dallas, but again, not like someone that's going to be at the top. But I'm sure that if Bobby Wagner hit free agency, he would be, maybe a top 5 free agent because of the fact that he's so unique at that position.
I look at Wagner like I look at like the two guys in San Francisco whose names are completely escaping me for some reason. Patrick
Bowman and Willis.
Yeah, Bowman and Willis. So I think honestly it's like those two guys, they play almost every down when they're healthy. And that's really valuable because they're, equally as good against the pass as they are against the run, and they're fast and physical. They set the tone. I think to me that's the same thing. I'm not saying Bobby Wagner is as good as those guys right now, but I think if we're talking inside linebackers in the NFL, it's like Bowman, Willis, Kuechly, and Wagner. Those are the top guys to me. And so I think you can't, I think that's a great point you made, Kenny, where most of the time you wouldn't take a middle linebacker over a left tackle. But in this case, Wagner's so important to the Seahawks defense that I think, you would. Even if Okung was better. I think even if, it makes it easier choice to me because I don't think Okung is necessarily a special left tackle. But I put him more in, the solid category. And so,
Yeah.
to me, I think Wagner is irreplaceable at this point.
I think another thing too, a lot of NFL teams last year and this year were hunting for an inside linebacker, whether they ran a 4-3 or a 3-4. They were hunting for an inside linebacker that had speed that could play on all three downs. And it's hard to find that. It's hard to find a guy. You could find a guy that can hit hard. You could find a guy that maybe has good instincts, but you see even in this draft, they're running maybe a 4-5, Stephon Anthony, Michael Kendrick's brother, Eric Kendricks, and then you see the other guys. I think McKinney. I don't know if he ran a 4-6, but the kid Perryman and Dawson, who are considered really good inside backers, and they're running 4.8s, and they still are going to be drafted fairly high. And then, you look at I think teams last year when they were sitting maybe from the 15 to the 22nd spot in the draft. And I don't know where Dallas picked, but all those teams wanted to take basically Calvin Pryor, HaHa Dix, or Ryan Shazier, essentially. And they all were gone before they could get them. This year there's only one safety worth drafting in the first round. And then there's better inside linebacker play, but I still think all of them are going to go fairly fast. And you see a lot of good teams that still have a lot of needs at the inside backer position, in terms of Arizona Cardinals, Green Bay Packers, playoff teams, and that type of thing. And they definitely need help there. So I think there is a little bit of a revival in that position in terms of having, and probably the success of Luke Kuechly and being reminded of, Thomas Davis and the San Francisco 49ers. I mean, really the best defenses in the last 3 or 4 years on average were the Carolina Panthers, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Seattle Seahawks. Definitely in the NFC, and all of them had good inside linebacker play. And I don't think that's just a total random occurrence. So I think we devalued the linebacker play. It was almost like Luke Kuechly's not worth the 7th pick, and non-pass rushing linebacker is fungible. I don't think that's really true if it's a really impact guy. And I think they're going to go those top 5 or 6 guys. I'm not talking about a Shaq Thompson who's a will-only type player, but if you can really be a little bit bigger, because like a Levante David fell because they considered him a will-only player. But if you're a true inside backer with a little bit more size and you have speed, I think you're pretty valuable in the NFL.
And then look at what the Eagles have done now. They went and traded for Kiko Alonso, and they're going to have Alonso and Michael Kendricks, so they're going to have tons of speed at the inside linebacker position, and that was like obviously that was a huge priority for Chip Kelly because he's willing to give up.
He was playing with Casey Matthews when he played the Seahawks, right?
Exactly, yeah, and he was a total liability.
Absolutely.
So it's definitely an interesting, and to piggyback on that, I think people were a little bit surprised that the Seahawks re-signed KJ Wright. I think, because he mostly plays will. He can play the strong side as well.
He would have had a good market. If he had free agency, he would have had a good market.
Yeah, because at the same time, he can play middle linebacker, and he could be an inside linebacker in a 3-4, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
So, it's an interesting conversation, I think, and it's cool how I think the Seahawks are set up for the long term, and that's why I think they definitely need to keep Bobby Wagner. I think they will. I'm not worried about that at all.
Me neither. It is cool.
I trust Pete Carroll on the linebacker. If you look back to his history back to 2001, 2002, and then you look at the success in the NFL, of all his linebackers, and I remember the Huskies couldn't cross the 50-yard line against him in like 2008 or whatnot because they had like Clay Matthews and Brian Cushing and Ray Maluga, and it was just like,
man, what a linebacker.
He's always had good linebackers. Him and Ken Norton, they've always produced NFL linebackers. Drafted them. They don't really miss. Like when you take Malcolm Smith in the 7th round and he plays all 4 seasons and never got cut. That's
Mike Morgan.
But even a 7th round pick that makes it to his 4th year of free agency and never got cut. That's so rare to have a 7th round pick last that long. And most of our 7th round picks don't last even probably the first camp. But to have that at the linebacker position, They know what they're looking for. Obviously, they're looking for speed, and length, and so it's just they have pretty good instincts in the linebacker position. They definitely know, the whole back seven. Pete Carroll pretty much knows what he's doing.
He's got that on lock. Yeah. Yeah, and that makes this whole free agency and draft period really interesting because, they've done such a good job of replenishing there in terms of taking guys in the draft that really fit in.
Pete Carroll doesn't really miss on defense. Even like some of the deals that don't work out great, like Jason Jones, they weren't crippling like Percy Harvin, in terms of or what Percy Harvin could have crippled, so to speak. Or you don't have situations where you're paying tons of money and getting maybe 40 to 60% of the value of what you're hoping for in terms of maybe like a Sidney Rice. I'm not saying it's Sidney Rice's fault. I'm just saying in terms of integration.
Well, have they ever taken a risk on a defensive player in terms of salary? Because I'm not even the most that I can even think of is a 2-year deal for Cliff Averill, which is nothing. And then
you're right. They don't
Yeah.
overextend themselves there, and but yet they still get good. I mean, you get Kevin Williams for $2 million. Even Alan Branch wasn't a slam dunk, but it wasn't.
He was effective.
It was effective. 2 years, $8 million. So they just on the defensive side of the ball, and even the decisions to sign, Earl Thomas and Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor early, all of them obviously good decisions, and then obviously the Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill things have worked out really well. So they really don't make mistakes on the defensive side of the ball very often.
If you look at some of the guys they've released over the years, and they're like now hitting the free agent market, and they're probably going to get paid. Like you said, Ron Parker. And like another guy, that's frustrating to me. And personal life aside, like Parrish Cox, like the Seahawks had him twice. They cut him twice before he ended up with the Niners. And then he's made a name for himself with the Niners now, and he's probably going to get paid. Not like a lot, but he's not going to be a street free agent.
Nope.
Same with Ron Parker. Will Blackman ended up being he didn't end up being that great for Jacksonville, but he's a guy that the Seahawks cut, and he ended up playing elsewhere. I think if you look at the guys in the secondary that have been with Seattle that ended up playing elsewhere, it's crazy to think about. It's like they're not cutting guys and they're ending up on the street, like, for the most part. They're ending up playing for other teams. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see sort of also, like, as far as what we saw with the Jaguars after Gus Bradley went there. It'll be interesting to see if there's that same connection with the Atlanta Falcons, whether or not Quinn is going to go after a Byron Maxwell, if he's going to go after a Malcolm Smith, or if he's going to do his own thing. It seems like logical that he might, because Smith, the Falcons, they have money to spend, and they have terrible defense, so you can't really do too much worse. But then again, if you have someone in there like Byron Maxwell, it's like you don't have to teach him what you want him to do, and you don't have to teach.
There's not the learning curve.
Right, and it's just like, and then you have a guy like Malcolm Smith who you can sign to a deal with not really any guarantees, or something that's decent, and you can promise him, a chance to start at outside linebacker, but then at the same time be like, I need you to be my coach on the field, the guy that I've been with for a few years, and exactly what's going to happen here. So it'll be interesting to see if the Falcons go that same route in terms of, sort of taking those players that don't make it in Seattle and instilling them into their team and philosophy as well.
I think the problem that the other NFL teams have with that is there's not a lot of good safety play. And there's not a lot of good safeties that you can go get,
Right.
And so I think the whole league values corners. They see the value of it. I think the whole NFL values the defensive line, edge rushers, defensive tackles, whether you run a 4-3 or a 3-4. I think the entire NFL pays money for that, drafts it high, values it. Obviously they know the value of the corner. And to a certain degree they value the other, every position's valuable, but it's like you can't. It's hard to find good safeties, and the Seahawks nailed 2 possible Hall of Fame safeties in one draft.
Ooh, he said it.
And it's like, I mean, that's such a game changer, and they can live it with their 3rd and 4th safeties being no names essentially,
Yeah.
and
right.
It's just such a major advantage that
Yeah.
that's not easy to replicate in Philadelphia. That's not easy to replicate in Jacksonville, and it's not easy to replicate in Atlanta. I can't even name a safety that plays for Atlanta, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I remember when
I assume they have one.
when they had DeCowd and they had William Moore. So they
Like
had
William
those
Moore
two
is-
guys. They were both like when they were doing good. I think DeCowd and Moore either they both made the Pro Bowl or Moore did, and then DeCowd went to Carolina. But it was definitely you knew who their safeties were then, but you don't now. And in terms of the free agents, you're right. It's a value versus scarcity, and that's why Devin McCourty could get a really big deal because he's by far the best safety available. If you're looking past that, you got Denoris Searcy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's how you say it, from the
Yep.
Bills, and Antrell Roll,
Yep.
Nate Allen. I mean, these guys are, and Louis
Yep.
Delmas. These guys are like,
Yep.
they're guys that you can play, but they're definitely. I mean, McCourty is special, but it's really hard, and that's why McCourty will get paid a lot of money.
And they signed big money to Louis Delmas and Jairus Byrd, and they didn't really get a lot of them.
Oh yeah,
And
Jairus Byrd, yeah.
They were trying to get that impact there. I think Ha Dix I don't know if that Calvin Pryor really panned out. I think, Eric
I don't think
Reed,
they were very happy with him.
Yeah, Eric Reed panned out for the Niners, and Bethea, I think. Deshaun
Yep.
Goldson never panned out, I don't think, for Tampa.
no.
And then they traded away Mark Barron. I guess Minnesota likes Harrison Smith, is from talking to Vikings fans that he hit, so that's good. But I mean, it's so sad that James Sample was a Husky that Sark didn't like. He didn't like Sark, and he transferred out. And these guys like Daniel Jeremiah and Kuiper are talking about that. So he played 1 year at Louisville, and he couldn't even really play for the freaking Huskies. Okay. And he's considered a possible third-round pick in this year's draft. And I'm just like, really? Like,
last year, because being going to Washington State and not having any of our players go in the first round, it was to have last year Deion Buchanan. That was not a guy that I expected at first to go in the first round. But it's sort of like one of those things where it's like there were 9 defensive backs because people were like, oh, they're making it so easy for quarterbacks to pass that we need to get guys that are talented or might be talented. So, for a guy like Buchanan to go in the first round, it really does show that teams are trying really hard to find a safety, and the fact that the Seahawks do have 2 that are 2 of the best 4 in the NFL is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think Buchanan was like a guy that when you always saw him like at Wazoo, it was always like, wow, this guy looks like an NFL player. He looks like he had everything. But at the same time, you're kind of thinking second-round pick. That's kind of what I was always thinking about him, second round. And he went in the first round, but yet I think Arizona's totally pleased, with that. Because he was still, it was still, a solid pick and better than a lot of the other first-round picks probably, in the bottom half of the first round. So they're happy, even though they kind of played him like a linebacker, and I haven't really kind of totally figured out how their defense works, but, he doesn't necessarily play like a true safety, but in the end, they're still happy with him.
Yep.
Well, we've gone over an hour here, so I think we could probably wrap it up. But yeah, that was a good talk on free agency, the Seahawks cap situation, Russell Wilson, and kind of the situation going into the draft. So for Kenny and Davis, I guess I'll just sign off for Real in the Field Goals episode. Whatever episode are we on? 3?
This
4?
is episode 4. Danny's third.
Episode 4.
But
all right.
4th overall, and I definitely want people to know that we'll be here every single Thursday talking about the Seahawks, talking about me, Kenneth Arthur, superstar, talking to great guests, and I want you guys to, you can get it at fieldgoals.com, or you can subscribe through iTunes or your podcast app to Field Goals Podcast. You should be able to find it, and you subscribe to that, and then when you subscribe, give us a rating, a 5-star rating, and saying how much you like the show. And then we'll keep going. We are definitely going to keep going, but yeah, I want people to subscribe through the podcast app, and then you can watch it on Field Goals as well, whatever you please.
And thanks to Davis for coming on again.
Definitely, and he just left, so We'll send that, and yeah, so we'll sign off now.